Welcome to the Americanism book study. I'm Cody Leibold. This is the 6th of 9 meetings, Saturdays through December 18th, 2021, and we are studying a new textbook of Americanism, The Politics of Ayn Rand. This week, the reading section was pages 87 through 104. You can go to christianintellectual.com/Americanism to get the replays of the previous videos or to sign up to join on Zoom. We're discussing the unique set of ideas behind the American way of government. And the two chapters this week are one from Stuart K. Hayashi on the alt-right, and he has a subheading, How to Recognize a Nazi. He's obviously not pro-alt-right. And then the other reading is from Leonard Peikoff on the necessity and efficacy of principles, with subheadings, Do we have to be consistent about principles? And what has been the history of human progress? He understands it as a battle between the essential ideas of Plato versus Aristotle. So this week we have two very different kinds of subject matter, one in the alt-right and then the other in the theory of human history. But we will have time to discuss both of those and then get into other questions you may have from previous material or previous chapters. Let's start by, if anyone has questions or topics that they want to make sure to include, put them in the comments, or you can just come on video and you can ask a question and we'll make sure and write them all down. Does anybody already have one that they want to drop in? Just let me know. Meanwhile, I'm going on and making sure everybody gets a chance to come in on video that wants to.
Yeah, Cody, I have some topics that I'd like to make sure to address in the alt-right topic, but I don't know if I can formulate it as a question. So I'll address the one for the principles chapter. I had a friend who was criticizing Peikoff's book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, and he was using the example of Atlas Shrugged, and he said, John Galt in Atlas Shrugged contradicts the principles of Objectivism because he's willing to die to protect Dagny, but reason is supposed to serve the higher interest of life, man's survival. And so he said that proves that the idea of keeping a consistent principle. He thought the only reason why an objectivist would want to be consistent with principles is for their psychological well-being. He said that's too weak of a reason to be consistent with principles. You need something higher. And so he said that wasn't inconsistency in objectivism. And I wondered if we would agree with that to an extent or not at all or all the way. And I thought that'd be a good topic to bring up when we get to the second part.
Great. I have that written down. Other topics, and I will start with the topic of the alt-right and what does it mean to be a Nazi. There are interesting points of view that we could, this book was written about 3 or 4 years ago, and we could point out there are some things in here that have come even more into the mainstream discussion, like, for example, the term globalist, or the question of whether there is a conspiracy originating in Davos, Switzerland, with the World Economic Forum. Some of the things that Steve Bannon was talking about before he got arrested and the Breitbart website was talking about 4 years ago are now more obviously actually correct. And so it seems like the objectivists were a little slow on the punch on that one. Nevertheless, the kinds of people that this chapter interacts with, like for example, Stefan Molyneux or Milo Stephanopoulos, or whatever his last name is, those guys, the criticisms against those guys are correct in my opinion, and the criticisms against this sort of quasi-Nazi movement or nationalist movement that wants to use the government power to make sure that we have a certain race in the United States is the majority forever, and the great replacement theory. This is all stuff that's in the discussion way more now that we have more Democrats in power compared to even it was 3 years ago. So questions that come up about that alt-right topic, let's hear those. Or prompts for conversation.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe touch on, I said I couldn't phrase this exactly as a question, but it seems that the author, sorry, cat, is suffering from not really taking, he kind of laughs at this idea that white people act like a victim all the time, and that's what makes people become alt-right. And that's certainly the element of the alt-right, but it seems like it doesn't address the very obvious acceptability of hatred towards white people that's become pretty mainstream. I mean, I found this tweet yesterday from an account that has a ton of followers. It's Bishop Talbert Swan, and it was saying, who slaughtered Native Americans and stole their land, enslaved, raped, murdered, brutalized, and dehumanized Africans, enslaved, colonized, and brutalized Black people in Africa and the Caribbean. All caps, white men, So it seems like the author here is saying, that's just, you're just using this as an excuse to be racist, white people. And he doesn't seem to address that as a very real phenomenon. And it could be due to what you're saying. It could be because it's 5 years or so ago when things were even different then. So maybe we could talk about that.
Jacob, do you have comments on that as we start up?
Well, I agree with that to an extent, but I wanted to add to that. I think that Stewart, the author, also doesn't really do a very good job of motivating the reader to classify the alt-right as Nazis, or really to define Nazi, right? He kind of starts out with, well, there's this idea that you can't be a Nazi unless you've committed violence. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, I agree with that. But what is necessary in order to consider somebody a Nazi? And
so he rejects the idea that you have to have committed violence.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I agree with him. I agree with him in rejecting that idea that you can be a Nazi without committing violence. But what else is required to consider somebody a Nazi, right? So what we've agreed that committing violence isn't a necessary attribute of being a Nazi, but what are the sufficient attributes, and what are the necessary attributes? Like what are they? And he kind of loosely describes, like by association, certain things that Nazis and the alt-right have in common. And I agree with all of those things. And I agree that thank you, babe. And I agree that there are certain respects in which the alt-right are Nazis, or at least Nazi sympathizers. And there are some actual Nazis in the alt-right. But he didn't do a very good job of defining the concept of Nazi in such a way that we could grasp it and say objectively, yes, there are certain men in the alt-right who absolutely fit that concept.
Right. I would say that in today's discourse, because it's so obvious that, Hitler is the bad guy of history in most people's mindset, the only people that I would feel comfortable calling a Nazi is somebody that calls himself a Nazi. Somebody that, that his Facebook profile has a picture of a Nazi smoking a cigar or something, or he's posting explicitly Nazi memes. If it's not, and I know people like that, and I've blocked them and I've tried to expose them. But the problem is if somebody is simply parroting Nazi talking points like "we need more space," or there needs to be a future for our people and our posterity, which it's like some Nazi slogan or something. Which, I mean, there's a lot of things in the Bible about caring about your posterity, right? So it's horrible because these people they're edgelords. They just push it just a little bit toward what, if you were historically literate, you would know is a Nazi slogan, even if it sounds like reasonable in some ways. If you just think about it in isolation, you realize if they're saying this and this and this all together, there's definitely something going on here, that they're dog whistling, and dog whistling is sneaky. So there's a thing about when people are trying to promote Nazi-like ideas, Nazi-adjacent ideas, they're going to try to use that dog whistle tactic. They're going to try to make it so that you can't just peg them and say, oh, you obviously agree with the things that the Nazi Party was teaching all across the board. So what Hayashi does in this chapter, I think he gets at some of the essentials, because he says Nazis are most well known for their designs on having racism codified into state policy. So that's one thing, racism in state policy. But by that criteria, then South Africa in the 1980s would also be Nazi, right? So we have to be careful about our definitions. There's a distinction between the Nazi Party and apartheid. That said, he says Nazi movements, both historical and contemporary, are social movements based on the idea that whites must have a nation state to themselves, where persons who are considered to be of undesirable races are notably absent. In case there's any ambiguity, somebody that's coming across this video for the first time, we are all 100% opposed to that idea. We don't believe in Nazism, we don't believe in apartheid. We're discussing it because these ideas need to be discussed, because they're being promoted by people in a sneaky way. So if you believe that there needs to be a white state, just because you think that white people are going extinct. If you believe that you need to have racism codified into the laws of your country, that would definitely make you a Nazi. I think that's as far as he goes towards defining the concept. Jacob, do you think that that's a sufficient definition?
Well, I think it's okay as far as it goes, but I think my concern is, just like you said, a lot of people are hesitant to call someone a Nazi unless they are self-consciously identifying as a Nazi, because it's such an overused epithet, right? And because of that phenomenon, it would have been wise, I think, for the authors in this book and Hayashi in particular, to either really carefully define what they mean by Nazi and then say, all right, here are the ways in which many aspects of the alt-right align with it, even if they don't self-consciously identify as Nazi, or to not use the terms or not to rely on the term so heavily, right? Because I want to say, look, even if you don't claim that you're a Nazi, even if you think that the Nazis really were objectively evil, if you think that whites need their own exclusive nation, and you think that racism should be instituted through politics, that's evil, right? Even if you're not a Nazi, even if you renounce Nazism, right? Even if you love Jews, as an example, right? You most likely you wouldn't say that somebody who loves Jews is a Nazi. So, but you can love Jews and still teach that white people need their own nation. But that's still evil. That's still a bad idea that needs to be fought. And that's still a bad idea that's prevalent on the alt-right that needs to be fought. And so my concern is that by labeling it all as Nazi, it becomes easily dismissive, that the concerns that we have here and that we share with the objectivists here become easily dismissed by other people because they say, oh, well, we're not Nazis, so it's not a big deal.
I agree with that. I think that the Nazi Party has a whole bunch of planks to its platform, and it's fascist, it's socialist, it's for the German workers, and so they would have had all kinds of different policies that we could evaluate on an independent basis. We could say, should there be socialized medicine? Should there be socialized education? These are Nazi values. Should the government be making laws that favor businessmen and that attempt to basically control the businessmen by granting them favors? What would you call it? A cronyism. That's distinct to the Nazi Party, but it's also coming into the United States. Each one of those different ideas, and then obviously the racism, and obviously the willingness to euthanize people that are sick or that are considered unwanted. All of that, we can evaluate each one of it and say, on every distinct point, the Nazis were wrong. And I think that one of the things that is coming up in the discussion lately, especially among Reformed Christians that are starting to accept this dissident right identity. I'm a hard right. I'm a tradcon is a related term for at least for some of them. One of the things that's coming up is they are trying to find one or two little fragments of what would have been found within within countries historically in Europe, including in Germany or including in Great Britain 200 years ago, or in France. And they're trying to come up with, is there anything in there worth saving? And they're not too concerned, because they've been called racist so many times. They're not too concerned if they're going to be associated with racism. This very term, the right versus the left, that came from the French Parliament at the time of the French Revolution. The people that wanted to preserve the older regime, the monarchy, were on the right side of the parliament, so they called them the right, and then the Jacobins were on the left. And sorry, Jacob, that name has to come up, but the Jacobins, and so that terminology then later was applied to the American conservatism, and they call that the right-wing conservatives. But then they also are calling the Nazi Party right wing, and it's a very muddy use of terms if you're going to be comparing Ted Cruz and Ronald Reagan to Adolf Hitler. Like the kinds of ideas that they uphold are radically different on economics and on race. And so anyway, it's frustrating that now, even with all of that muddiness, you have these tradcons coming out and saying, we're hard right, we're the dissident right. I don't want to associate with that if that's the connotation is that you're okay with being associated with Nazism. I see, Isaac, you've had your hand raised. Go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, well, the first thing I wanted to say was surefire way to tell somebody's a Nazi is if they have a profile picture of Kyle Rittenhouse. So we all know that. But
Wait. Sarcasm doesn't always translate.
I'm joking.
Yeah, we've got our friend Walter Hudson. He's a black
know.
man, and his profile picture is Kyle.
We love Walter. He's not a Nazi. I'm joking. Okay, so that's cleared up. The real thing that I wanted to say was that I think Nazi, like, and I think this is kind of what we're saying, it's not a great term. And I would say because it's a political party that's time bound to that culture. And so I would agree with you guys. You can't really call somebody a Nazi unless they self-identify as being a Nazi. And really what we want when we're trying to say that somebody's a Nazi, there's a better term. There's these characteristics to being a Nazi is really what we're getting at. And these characteristics could be, the fact that Nazis thought that white people or their race should have their own nation, but not just have their own nation. So that's one characteristic, that their race should have their own nation. Another characteristic would be that they should dominate other nations. I think that was a characteristic of being a Nazi. Another one was that you believe that your race was superior. But then another related concept, but really different concept, is not just that you're superior, but that the other races are so inferior that they are not worthy of rights, essentially. So all these things, in my opinion, they're characteristic of being a Nazi. But even if somebody believed all of those things, it'd still be somewhat problematic to try to label somebody a Nazi because it was a political party. Yeah, that's just.
I agree.
I think there may be a better term, honestly, that has that shares those characteristics in a conceptual framework. But I don't know what it would be.
The difficulty is people don't want to have their ideas identified too clearly. And this is one sign of dishonesty, is when somebody says, well, yes, I believe in Western civilization, and I believe that there's like this three-legged stool that created the values of Western civilization, and they are, individual rights and the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition and white genes. And you're like, what? Excuse me, like, how can you make that the cause of Western civilization and the specific values? And then, you ask them to define Western civilization, and it turns out that they're defining it in ways that equivocate from one way to another. Jacob, did you have something you want to add there?
Yeah, I just want to say, a lot of what I see among the alt-right today, especially within the Christian factions that are gravitating toward it, you see that first idea that whites should have their own nation often, but a lot of times they explicitly deny that second idea that Isaac mentioned, which is that whites should dominate, the white nation should dominate the non-white nations, right? A lot of times they try to water it down, make it sound more reasonable by saying, no, black should have their own nation too. And Hispanic should have their own nation, and Asians should have their own nation. Like every ethnicity just needs its own nation, and that way we'll all be at peace because we don't commingle very well. But then implied in that often is the third thing that Isaac mentioned, which is the idea that whites are superior, and that gets to what you just mentioned, Cody, the whole barstool thing of white genes being the third leg of the barstool. And a lot of times they won't be super explicit about this, but the implication is, look, whites just are better, and so it's easier for us if we all are together, and it's easier for the other people who are weaker than us to just be all together and not be burdened by our greatness, is the idea. And you can kind of understand the psychological motivation behind it. I don't want to sympathize with them too much, but given our current cultural atmosphere where being a heterosexual right-handed white male is the epitome of evil, right? And that's preached from every institution in Western culture. You can kind of understand it as a knee-jerk reaction of, well, screw you. I'm not that evil, and I need some sense of self-esteem. And in a culture and in a society, especially in a religious culture, where there isn't a rational epistemology and where the individual is snuffed out and anathema, where everything has to be collectivized, it makes sense that in order to feel some sort of self-esteem, you're going to gravitate toward a white self-esteem, a white collective that is self-assertive rather than self-abasing, right? So the antidote, and we'll probably get around to this, but I think this is the emphasis that we need to be emphasizing to these people and to people who might be tempted to join them. The antidote is individualism. Like you've got worth, and you should have self-esteem as an individual, right? Like I'm looking at us four white men sitting here, and we're all doing fairly well. We're all pretty confident. We stand opposed to the leftist narrative that we are weak, or that we are oppressive, or that we are evil inherently because of our skin color, et cetera, right? We stand up strong against those things, but we don't do it because we are white men. We don't give a crap about the fact that we happen to have white skin, right? We are standing together here and standing against the evil of the world because of our conviction of the power of our individual reasoning capacity, and because of the values and the principles that we've discovered as a result of that, and those things that we have in common, and we're standing together because of that, right? And so we need to try to project that the strength of the individual and binding together as individuals with common rational convictions as the antidote to the knee-jerk reaction of binding together based on just the absurdity of skin color.
Andrew, I saw you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on something, maybe an opposite problem to what we commonly see is we're going to define Nazi, and this is typically in the culture, we're going to define Nazi really broadly. It's just anybody that's like to the right of Mitt Romney is a Nazi. But I think that Hayashi might, at least in one way, have defined Nazi too narrowly, and maybe you'll disagree. He talks about one of the tenets being white people should have their own homeland. But are we really defining the idea there by its essentials? Because would a Japanese nationalist group that fit all the other criteria not be a Nazi group because they didn't care about, I don't care about what white people do, we just want a Japanese, ethnicity, exclusive place, or, whatever, Mongolian, or whatever it is. It seems like he's saying this really only pertains to whites. Do you think that's for a reason? Do you think that if you go outside that you're not a Nazi, or is he really defining the concept by the essentials here?
It seems to me that if you are going to have a definition of Nazi, it has to include white supremacy as part of it. It couldn't be Asian supremacy or something like that. You could say that it's, you could compare a different party that is, like for example, during World War II, the leaders of Japan were racist and they were imperialist. You could say that that's similar to the Nazi Party, and obviously they became allies for that reason. But I wouldn't call them Nazis.
So it seems like that would kind of trigger Isaac's objection, which is now it seems like we are being anachronistic, but it may not be a useful term now because we can really only apply to one group or one application of this set of ideas that was practiced 100 years ago by the National Socialists.
Yeah, it's one of those. It's a question of when there are clusters of ideas. The more you zoom in, the more you can see the distinctions between, variant A and variant B of idea one. The more you zoom out, the more you can see that, well, variant A and variant B are very close to each other conceptually compared to number 2 and number 7. So anyway, I think it's just a matter of trying to be clear in your communication. Andrew, while I have you on the video, you had asked this question about the alt-right. Is there a problem of not taking seriously the idea that white people act like a victim all the time, or are being victimized in some ways, like being talked badly about all the time? Can you expand on your thought there, and we'll discuss that?
Yeah, this is more in the vein of what Jacob was saying of the way that they framed it in this book leaves them open, I think, to some criticism. And here's one way. This is coming from agreeing with the thrust of this chapter completely. Like you mentioned with the Davos thing, there are people, political and economic actors, who have explicitly said, we want, maybe not in these exact terms, but we want to reduce the proportion of white people in America, or we think it'd be good if we could, increase the number of other races so that white people aren't, the focus. And you see this all the time. We need to get the focus off of whiteness. Whiteness is evil. Whiteness is this and that. Well, what's funny is that was the kind of language that was used towards the minorities that the Nazis actually persecuted. All the examples that Hayashi uses are of people like Milo Yiannopoulos raising that flag and saying, look at all these people that hate whites, so therefore we should do some Nazi policy. But he doesn't say, all right, people who are concerned about X, Y, and Z, here's the real solution. And Jacob touched on what the real solution should be, which is individualism. But that I think that's a weakness of the and again, it could be due to when it was written, but it's a weakness of the chapter in the sense that it leaves it open to this criticism of, wait a second, there really are people who have this desire to decrease the proportion of whites in America. And that's, I think, triggering a lot of this kind of backlash, this kind of like white sympathy, white solidarity backlash. But it would have been good, I think, if the chapter had addressed that and said, all right, that's a real concern, but here's the real solution.
So another part of this chapter that I wanted to bring up is on page 89 at the bottom. The chapter begins to describe Steve Bannon's understanding of the cultural moment. And let me just read you a quote. And this in my notes inside the book, I just wrote, this did not age well. So I'll just let you know that, like, my thought is that there may be more truth in here, and it's not completely something to be thrown out. But that said, we need to find which part of it's true and which part of it's not true. It's important that we look at it honestly. So this is summarizing Bannon's view: 21st century nationalists in the Nazi tradition, which he's calling Bannon, which I don't agree with, are not always brazen about reviling Jewish international business executives in particular, but they are not shy when it comes to throwing around conspiracy theories about international business executives as some monolithic class. Now, if you've listened to Michael O'Fallon at the Sovereign Nations lately, the international businessmen, they do talk. And a lot of them knew that the Great Reset was coming before COVID-19 ever happened. I mean, so there is something to be said for the fact that these people do consider themselves our ruling class, and they act that way, as you can see if you pay attention to the what has been coming out of the World Economic Forum and how that is actually directly affecting world policy from government leaders. Anyway, so then it goes on, this contemporary epithet they apply to cosmopolitan business executives, often even Jewish or non-white, is globalist. Now, 4 or 5, 6 years ago, when I heard people say globalist, that immediately identified them as, oh, this is an alt-right person, and they're going to start using like the C word, like I'm not even going to say it because it's just kind of a gross sounding word, but they're going to call everybody a that, and they're just going to say globalist as if I know what that means. And so I would say, by globalist, do you mean you believe that we should be able to hire people of any nationality and buy products from other countries unless we're at war with them? Because if so, then I would endorse that theory. But that's a different proposition from the idea that there should be laws that the United States and other countries get into together, and they agree that they're going to transfer wealth from the countries based on carbon taxes and all that. And so if you listen to Michael O'Fallon's material, you realize there really is a group of people that want to bring America to its knees using environmental policies, and using the system of basically extracting wealth from the richer or the more white countries and transferring it to the countries that are less rich or less white. That's for real. And perhaps those people would identify as globalists, or like George Soros being a fan of the Open Society. He has a set of foundations called the Open Societies Foundations. These things exist, and these people are funding Christian organizations. So I mean, we had to confront that. If you haven't seen Enemies Within the Church, the Judd Saul film, that also gets into that, and it exposes who is receiving money from the Kern Family Foundation, from James Riotti, and from George Soros. You need to know that Southern Seminary in Louisville took money from the Kern Foundation and other things like that, and that partly accounts for why you've got critical race theory and why you've got statism and collectivism being taught in some of these institutions. Anyway, he goes on in the chapter. He says, hence the former chairman of a website that has made itself a hub for the white nationalist movement, which is true, unfortunately. He's talking about Breitbart. He says, he quotes Bannon, the first order of business is to undo all the damage of globalism that allowed Silicon Valley and Wall Street and Hollywood and the imperial capital right here in Washington, D.C. and London and Beijing and Davos, the party of Davos. He's criticizing this as if it's just ridiculous on its face, but there really is a getting together of Silicon Valley and Wall Street, especially if you listen to Michael O'Fallon lately on what's going on with Vanguard and BlackRock and the Democratic Party and the deep state. These are all things that we've become much more aware of lately. So I'm sorry, Stuart, but you're gonna have to issue a correction on this, or at least you're gonna have to expand and say, in light of what we now know, so follow your objectivity principle, which we hold you to, because we know you understand it. Jacob, go ahead.
So I think a really helpful category or distinction here is the difference between global rule and global trade.
Yes.
And that's the distinction that I wish that they would have made in this book, because they do make that, like, Yaron Brook makes that distinction, and it's helpful. The globalist view that we oppose and that we join the alt-right in opposing, so to speak, is the ones who want global rule, who want a global government or global governing bodies that cooperate with each other and transfer wealth, et cetera, right? We oppose that, and we agree with anybody who wants to oppose that. But everybody seems to conflate that with a completely different concept of global trade, right? You don't need global rule in order to have global trade. You can trade with other countries without being ruled by them in any way, shape, or form, right? And we are all for global trade, but those two get packaged together as a package deal, to use Rand's terminology. So you end up having to choose, all right, if you don't want global rule, then you also have to oppose global trade. And if you want global trade, then you also are seen as wanting global rule, so that you can't separate them in most people's views. And this is especially true on the alt-right. Like the alt-right refuse to separate those two concepts. And that's what we need to do in order to clarify this debate and to stand against the globalists in the terms of global rule, and to stand with or for global free trade. Because they are real issues, like Cody was just saying, and I completely agree. And I think these guys really need to get with the game. And there's other stuff going on there, I think, with their hesitancy to recognize some of these leftist threats, right? The threat of explicit anti-whiteness and really, really vicious institutionalized racism against whites. Like they're loath to recognize that. And if they do recognize it, they kind of just laugh at it and say, oh, it's silly, it's goofy. They don't say it's evil, it's dangerous. They say it's goofy, right? Even Yaron Brook uses, goofy or wacko terminology rather than dangerous, evil, wicked, which is absurd. But then also this sort of leftist global rule push, objectivists are loath to recognize that as an actual threat. So I want to agree with Cody and say we absolutely need to recognize those things as legitimate threats that are looming in serious ways. But we need to make distinctions that the alt-right is refusing to make in order to get the messaging clear.
With that term globalism, one clue that somebody is trying to conduct a package deal operation is just making up new terms with the ism at the end of it. The global trade versus the global rule, packaged together under a single ism. It's very suspicious. All right, Isaac, I saw you had your hand raised.
Just wanted to make a cute comment to help the folks at home if they're struggling with these distinctions. Something that I thought of, the way you can think of the difference between global rule and global trade. Global trade is about freedom. It's global free trade, whereas global rule is more like global slave trade, where they want to be slave owners and they want to enslave everybody. Just a cute comment.
Keeping things cute. All right, so one summarizing remark about this chapter is at the end they point out that Nazism found at its foundation, one of its errors that it makes is that it's racial determinism. And any kind of determinism is a major problem that is leading to the egalitarianism that we have in society today, on the premise that people cannot survive or thrive based on their own merit because of the conditions in which they were born. You have the John Rawls egalitarian theory that says that the state needs to come in and chop down all of the tallest poppies. And it doesn't matter if overall that hurts society, or it doesn't matter if it hurts the people that got chopped down. What matters is that nobody has to be made to feel inferior. And that's a racist idea, or that's a classist idea. And what I mean by that is it makes a faulty judgment against people to say that you can't pull yourself out of poverty or of generational poverty or bad situations. Reject the determinism idea, social determinism, and then from that you have the beginnings of individualism. So let's go into the chapter from Peikoff now. And so this was a question that let's see. I'm going to read the question. It says, criticism of Peikoff's Opar. John Galt contradicts objectivism, being willing to die to protect Dagny. Spoiler alert, there actually is a man named John Galt. Let's not get too much into the story, but he says that he would be willing to die for Dagny, and he loves her. Being consistent with principles just because of psychological well-being, is that really all there is to it, just for psychological well-being? Andrew, could you expand on your question a bit more, because I believe there's quite a bit to the question.
Yeah, I'll try to get this out of the Atlas Shard context. I was talking with a friend of mine who's a Christian, Reformed Christian, and I was explaining to him how, look, Ayn Rand's ideas are not incompatible with Christianity, and he was talking about the fact that in Opar, Leonard Peikoff's summary of Ayn Rand's work, in my friend's estimation, there was no sufficient ground for being consistent with principles, because he said, say that you were willing to die for what you believed in, or a person you loved. That would contradict objectivism, because in objectivism, man's life is the standard of value, and therefore reason is subservient to man's life. And so if you're going to die for something you believe in, you should, under objectivism, so the objection goes, throw away reason and throw away consistency, because, well, now it's not serving life anymore. So up until that point, it should be used, and then you should throw it away. That's what my friend said, that, if you're going to be a consistent objectivist, that's how you would come out. And I certainly think that there are major problems with objectivism, in the sense that they don't have a reason to believe, or they think they don't have a reason to believe in life after physical death. And so that's going to run into some problems, partially because they're ignoring what they actually themselves believe about the soul or consciousness. But I wondered if he was right in that criticism or not. And I know we've talked about this in our own private conversations, but I thought it'd be good to bring up in this.
The first point to raise is just that if he thinks that is not a compatible idea with objectivism, it means that he hasn't read either The Virtue of Selfishness or Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, where Rand explicitly describes how what happened between Galt and Dagny conforms to her ethical theory. So he's not actually familiar with Rand's account, and that's but nobody should be really saying, oh, her presentation in that book is inconsistent with her philosophy if they don't even know her philosophy. So it's as simple as that. But Jacob, I know you have the answer to this one. Go ahead, Jacob.
So the value of life in objectivism is not to merely survive. It is to live as a man. And that is the thing that too many Christians, unfortunately, don't understand, that they can't even conceptualize it because they merely survive. And in fact, sometimes they actively try not to live as a man because they think their morality demands it. But Rand is holding up the value of living as a man, which means a particular quality of life, not merely surviving. And in a context where it is impossible to live that quality of life, merely surviving is not a value. And that is what's at play in the example in Atlas Shrugged that was being brought up. In a world where your highest values are being stripped from you and you are being used to serve for the destruction of your values, you don't care to live, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's a deeply moral thing. Now, if you believed in an afterlife, that there might be stronger motivation to live even through such a scenario, right? As Christians, we wouldn't, for the most part, resort to suicide if somebody that we loved was taken from us, but we still are willing to die if necessary for the sake of certain values. And the principle, though, is that we want to preserve a certain quality of life, which includes standing for convictions, right? If I were to fold on my convictions on principles for the sake of surviving, from that point onward, I would not be living as a man. I would be living as a subhuman creature with the shame of knowing that I wasn't worthy of the life that I was living because I had betrayed everything that is valuable about life. And that's why you do it.
There's something to know about the situation with Galt and Dagny is that she was going to be tortured so that he would serve their purposes. And so he knew that if he ended his life, the torturers would have no more motivation to torture her. You see, so that as long as he's under their power and she's under their power, and this is the situation that is being confronted, as long as he continues living, she's going to be continually tortured. That's the situation. It's not an argument for, oh, I lost, like my dog died or my dad died or something like that, and then you're like, well, I don't have anything to live for anymore. And I don't even think that it's my, the person that I love most in the whole world, my spouse died. I mean, in the case of the very author, Ayn Rand, her spouse died and she became very depressed, but she lived for another couple of years until she died of cancer. So it's not like she's advocating as part of the objectivist system that suicide is a good thing. It's simply that life at any cost is not the same thing as life as man. And it's life as man that's the standard. Andrew, does that clarify the question? Do you feel like you've been equipped to answer your friend if he were to raise that topic?
Well, to kind of go off something Jacob said, he mentioned the shame that you would carry with you because you've decided to abandon your values in order to live. But does that fall prey to my friend's objection? Well, the only detriment that you suffer is psychological.
Well, the question is, did the shame come for good reasons? Like, do you actually, if you're being rational, do you assess that the thing that caused you to be able to secure your life and well-being was deeply immoral? Do you carry that knowledge with you that what you did was immoral? And if so, it's not the shame that's the bad thing, it's the immorality that's the bad thing, and the shame is how you experience that reality.
Well, and I would want to say, what do you mean merely psychological? Are you a Christian or not? The psychological is the spiritual. Are you saying what's wrong with being permanently marred in your spirit? What? Yes, of course that's terrible. Of course that's something that you shouldn't want. Of course that's worse than losing a limb. Like, what are you talking about?
But there's also, I think that the objection in using that term psychological, it might have been talking about subjective feelings. And we have to distinguish, not everything that happens in your soul is a subjective feeling.
Yeah, yeah. Like Cody said, the question is it deserved? Is it right for you to feel that way? And if it is right for you to feel that way, then you aren't going to be able to escape feeling that way, and you shouldn't. And you know that you shouldn't. That's the spiritual corruption that a man should not want to go on living with.
Over to you, Isaac. I saw your hand raised.
I think it's also important to remember that Ayn Rand conceptualizes man as a hero. And so when you talk about the idea of somebody potentially giving up their life, I think you have to think about the idea of worthiness. Is what I'm about to give up my life for, is it worthy? And would I consider myself heroic for dying for this thing? And the power of individualism is that it doesn't matter what other people think if they don't regard you as a hero for dying for this thing. But it only matters that you yourself consider it heroic and worthy to die for that thing. And that's just within the objectivist framework. Let's add God to it now, right? So still, it doesn't matter what other people think. It only matters what you think. But also, as a Christian, it matters what God thinks and what God considers worthy and moral and right and heroic. Think about Christ. He was not just merely moral or merely perfect. He was a hero. He was the greatest hero this world has ever seen. He lived a worthy life, and he died because it was worthy. He died for a worthy and just reason. And it's one of the reasons why we praise him. But it's not the only reason. So I think, if you were to, our highest value as individualists or as objectivists isn't our own life. It really isn't. I would say it's not, because if it were, then your friend would probably be correct to say that we should throw away reason if it's the thing that's causing us to die. So our greatest value isn't our own life. You have to think about the idea of worthiness and being a hero, and you have to consider what your greatest values are and what is worthy of dying for.
When you say, is your greatest value your own life, one of the ways that you have to understand that is, your life has a certain span, at least the life on earth that we have. And you have to make a choice about what kind of life that will be. And okay, so I saw a comic a while back, from those little alien guys, Nathan Pyle and his alien guys. And somebody says, if you eat too much of those mineral crystals on your food, it's going to shorten your life. And then the other guy answers and he says, well, perhaps I prefer more mineral crystals and less duration. Like, you have to decide what kind of life you're going to have. And some, people that jump out of airplanes for fun, or people that do risky jobs, they make a decision that the kind of life that they want to have is going to involve this amount of risk, this amount of reward, for this amount of duration, most likely. And in the case of John Galt, his decision to not continue living as somebody who had betrayed his loved one would be the decision to affirm his own life for the duration that he was able to have it, and then to recognize that he's not able to have life as a man beyond that duration. So I actually think that he does uphold his life as his own value, but it's life as a man is the standard of value, and it distinguishes between like the purpose. The purpose of values is your own life, your own well-being, but the standard of value is life as a man, a rational being. Isaac, does that does that change your perspective a little bit?
No, that you clarified it perfectly, and I just want to add, like, I totally agree with that. My clarification, I would just add, when I say our lives aren't our greatest value, or at least I'll just speak for myself, my life isn't my greatest value. That isn't to say my life isn't a very high value. I highly value my own life, but it's not my greatest value. And I think what we're saying is that an even greater value than our own lives is quality of life, and it's worth sacrificing. Maybe you guys can add better clarity to this than I can, but it's worth sacrificing something to achieve this higher value of quality of life.
Yeah. To bring it full circle, we've been saying it. So one distinction is the distinction between mere survival and living as a man, right? Mere survival is not a value. Or at least we're saying it's not the highest value. It's not the ultimate value. Mere survival, right? That's not the highest value. The highest value is living as a man, or to use Isaac's terminology, which is the same thing, living as a hero. And so in a sense, yes, it's quality of life, but notice life is still in there. It's a particular type of living, not mere survival. It's living as a man, living as a hero. I would rather die a hero than live a second longer as a coward and a corrupt subhuman creature.
Cool. So I think that's a good answer to the question that Andrew had raised. And Andrew, if you want to jump in and you can expand on it, or we can move on to other topics. This chapter from Peikoff actually has quite a lot, and so we couldn't get through it all, but I'm happy to introduce more topics unless you had anything else, Andrew.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things that I found in the end, or the second half of Peikoff's chapter, is he's talking about understanding Western civilization and its history as the battle between Plato and Aristotle. And he makes that connect to epistemology, because the question of epistemology is, is there a division between our perception and our concepts, and how do those things relate to each other? And then he ties that into this idea of there's a dichotomy that a lot of people have between between theory and practice. And that is obvious within the Greeks all the way back to the time of Pythagoras, when they began to realize that there's power in theories and numbers and things like that. Then they became they decided that the wise person's preoccupation should be with thinking about numbers and thinking about principles, but that in order to gain wisdom and knowledge, you didn't necessarily have to have firsthand experience of doing something. It was more of an intellectual only type of a knowledge. And this idea is present in Plato as well. It's like Plato codified it. And then Aristotle saw how ridiculous it was, and he rejected it, said that no, our concepts have to originate in our observations and on our firsthand knowledge. And so Aristotle, to the extent that he was an Aristotelian, was a naturalist and a scientist. And so Peikoff characterizes the two different ways of approaching knowledge throughout history as this idealism or Platonism, and then this other approach, this objectivity that you see in Aristotle. And the battle throughout history has often been between these two sides, but sometimes construed incorrectly. So one incorrect construal of objectivity is called empiricism. And then you get this battle between the historical empiricists like Locke and Bacon and Newton, and then the rationalists, which would be they would be the ones that came along the same ideological line as Plato in the idealism. And eventually that idealist and rationalist mindset turns into Kant and Hegel and even Marx. You can see Marx is definitely not, his theories are not affected by observation of reality. It just comes from the mind, just like Hegel. So I raise all those topics just because I wanted to point out there is something as I read through this that I disagree with Peikoff about the way he frames certain things, because he says that Aristotle's objectivity and approach to taking your concepts from the facts of reality, he calls that worldliness. And it's an unfortunate use of the term, because as a Christian, I read worldliness and I think, oh, well, that means, loving the world more than you love God. And you can see why Christians, when they encountered this view of Plato versus Aristotle, for so long, they were much more interested in Plato. And there's, even after Aquinas brought Aristotle back into prominence, Christians have tended more toward being Platonists than Aristotelians. But this is what he writes on page 97. This is Leonard Peikoff writing. He says, Aristotle, Plato's devoted student for 20 years, is the first thinker to systematize worldliness. His metaphysics upholds the primacy of existence, his epistemology, the validity of reason, his ethics, the ideal of personal happiness. And so when I read worldliness, I just mean it's that famous picture from Raphael where Plato is pointing up and he's holding the book, and Aristotle is pointing down and he's holding the other book. And then they're in the court of the philosophers. And you can see that it's everywhere. It's a very common painting. And the battle of history is summarized by that painting. Is where do concepts come from? Do they come down from above, or we know them intuitively, and then the world just sort of reminds us of our concepts, like Plato? Or do our concepts come from our observations? And Aristotle is right, because he has his hand down and he says we learn things by our senses, and then we integrate them into concepts. That's his theory. That's Rand's theory as well. Rand just worked out some of the problems with Aristotle's, and he expanded on it, or Rand expanded on it. So that's one thing about this chapter that I think it's just unfortunate that objectivists, because of their terms, they raise so many flags for Christians. If you understand what he was saying by worldliness, you'd understand Christians since at least the time of Aquinas have believed in the exact thing that he's advocating here. And then another example of terms that objectivists get confused about. If you look over on page 99, this is a quote from, or a description of Rand's ideas. They're talking about faith and force. So here's what it says. Faith and force, as Ayn Rand observed, entail each other, a face exemplified in the feudalism of the medieval centuries. But reason and freedom entail each other too. So in Rand's use of the terms, faith and force are one thing. And then there's reason and freedom, and that's another thing. If you look at the newest edition of the Objective Standard magazine, you've got that on the cover, right? You've got Nazism, communism, and the Star of David and Jesus on the cross. And they're all like treated as one thing, faith and force. And they're all mixed in together right there. And it's frustrating. Jacob, you had a comment about that. Could you maybe share what you posted on social media?
Well, I think just to clarify, in general, what she means by faith in that combination of faith and force is faith as an epistemology. And with that, we agree, right? We agree that faith is not an epistemology. It is not a means of knowledge. And the Bible never presents it as such. The problem is that a lot of really sloppy thinking Christians do treat it as such, right? And so in a way, she's identifying something true about what happens to be the case among many Christians, but it's not what Christianity teaches, and it's not what we ought to affirm, right? And so she juxtaposes that with reason, right? There's faith and force, and then reason and freedom. So she's saying reason needs to be our means of knowledge. Reason needs to be our epistemology, as opposed to faith as an epistemology. And when faith is used as epistemology, the only rational or the only logical result is going to be force in society, because that's the only way to deal with people if you can't reason together, right? So she's absolutely right about that dynamic. The problem is that Christianity does not teach faith as a means of knowledge. And that's that's a challenge that we have before us, because virtually every other religion does teach faith as a means of knowledge. And many Christians do teach faith as a means of knowledge, right? And so this is one of the reasons why we war so strongly against presuppositionalism and Reformed epistemology, because those are two of the most ardent forms of faith as a means of knowledge within the Christian world today. And if we don't separate true Christianity from that epistemology of faith as a means of knowledge, then the result is going to be force in society, no matter how much we protest against it or claim not to like it. So long as the church collectively supports faith as a means of knowledge, that's our trajectory.
Jacob, your explanation there of how things are going to happen is confirmed both theoretically and historically. So historically, an example would be the Spanish Inquisition. You had a situation where faith was treated as something that just must be accepted, and then you had the government saying, okay, well then we're going to empower the Spanish Inquisition. We're going to empower priests to go around imprisoning people or even killing people if they disagree with what faith teaches. Theoretically, you can also see the connection because consider the work of Cornelius Van Til and his followers, Rousas Rushdoony and Greg Bahnsen, the same people that advocated this thing that we think is blind faith, this presuppositional theory, ended up creating these theonomic theories as well, where they don't believe in religious liberty. And they would end up doing the kinds of things that we saw in the Spanish Inquisition. So that's why, one of the reasons why FT&CI exists is to combat this whole constellation of ideas that is going to lead to a theocratic state in the United States if we're not careful. If you read the dim hypothesis from Leonard Peikoff, I think his last book that he published, he would argue that the likely future of the United States is that people are going to just be so sick of the nihilism of the Obama era that they're going to turn to faith and force. And they're going to say, we don't care if we have to have a strongman to get rid of all these Democrats. And what's going to come next is going to be a conservative nationalist Christian or quasi-Christian coalition, and that would be theonomic. So we've got concerns about that. I can hear from my family stirring that I need to wrap up. But let me just close with a couple of, I thought, very helpful insights in this chapter. On 103, we read, Ayn Rand is to Aristotle what Kant is to Plato. I think that is so helpful that, so Kant took Plato and made it as extreme as it could be, turned up the dial on it, made it more consistent with some of Plato's premises. Ayn Rand is doing the same thing with Aristotle, and for that we can be thankful if we will just understand her epistemology. And so that's where we're going to go. I think after we do this Americanism book study, the next thing that I'm going to want to do is look at the book by Leonard Peikoff, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. I think that would be a good book for us to read together at some point in the future. I don't know exactly when, but that would be the next one I'd want to do. And then I will close with this one other thought. This is from page 104. This chapter mentions that unless there are new intellectuals, then eventually the lights in the West are going to go out. There is going to be a decline. America, the free beacon of the world, is going to decline. And so we are doing our part to be the Christian version of what Rand is talking about here. That's why we're called For the New Christian Intellectual. If anybody didn't already figure that out, it's an homage to the fact that there was a call from Ayn Rand that there must be new intellectuals, and that's what we believe in. We believe that there must be new intellectuals, and especially if you look in Christian academia. Oh, do we need new Christian intellectuals? I don't know if you saw that joke of a Christian intellectual the other day, was the name Greg Thornbury or something, saying basically PhDs aren't capable of lying or being dishonest. That's what Southern Seminary creates, if you didn't know that. So that's why I'm not planning to become a PhD, and that's why Jacob currently is not planning to become a PhD. You got a spy behind you, Jacob. That's part of our story. Is why we both pursued the seminary route and decided not to do that, because who would hire us to be a professor in Christian academia, and who would we be willing to even associate with in Christian academia at this point? It's not a good situation. So that's why instead of trying to become the best of the old, we're trying to equip the new. That's what we do at christianintellectual.com. You should subscribe. So go to christianintellectual.com/subscribe. And if you want to make sure you're in the next couple of videos that we have for this series, go to christianintellectual.com/Americanism. So thank you for watching today. Make sure and give the YouTube video a like, and you're welcome to jump in or send questions for the upcoming weeks. Thank you for joining, and I'll see you next week, Saturday, 9 a.m. Eastern. God bless.